All right. So today we're going to talk about stress. And I have been obviously studying stress for a long time. I got into it because of my mom. My mom had MS and she actually passed away of cancer. So one of my things was I could see myself going down her path and seeing myself very reactive in life. And one of the things that I started doing was yoga. And then that led into Ayurveda and where I'm at now. So my initial start was because I saw how stress was affecting my mom, and I didn't like what had happened to her. And I wanted my life to be as healthy as I possibly could because I knew I had good genetics. I had plenty of grandparents that lived to be way into their hundreds. So I know that I have the ability to be able to live a long, healthy life. So I wanted to be able to encourage that process. And we are designed to last a long time. So I'm going to discuss what stress is and how it shows up. And then after that, the lecture that follows will be the immune lecture. So they're very closely linked. They do feed upon each other and affect each other on a firsthand basis. So we'll discuss stress and then we'll go into the immunity afterwards. So, all right. So Hans Seeley in 1930, he's a University of Montreal professor, said general adaptation syndrome. So that's what he called stress, the stress of today, general adaptation syndrome. This means as a human body's basic reaction to any threat, no matter what it is, physical or psychological, is more or less the same regardless of its threat source. So this means that our body does not know the difference between an actual threat, so a bear attacking us, versus our mind perceiving something threatening to happen. So we are in a world that is very, very different than the more primitive days. So when our bodies created these mechanisms of defense, we had to do fight or flight in order to be able to react to things. But today's fight or flight is usually caused by perceived stress. So stress that doesn't even exist or has been prolonged for some reason. There's been other research done around stress. So there's been a lot of research around stress in the last 20 years, significant amount of research done around stress and how it influences our immune system and our inflammatory response. So our body's natural response is to have stress, and then it activates our immune system, which activates inflammation. So inflammation is not a bad thing in a life or death situation, because what it does is it helps our body to fight against illness, which would be one, fight against infection, which would be the other, and creates a healing process. So if we get a cut, our body, that is a stress response. It's a mild form of it. But if we get a large gash, then our body has to go into some sort of fight or flight response to be able to not let us bleed to death, to create an immune response so we don't get an infection. So these things are all supposed to happen. So our fight or flight response is supposed to happen. It's just when our mind makes up the stress versus the actual stress, we can't decipher the difference. We haven't evolved far enough, or I have no idea why we haven't evolved far enough to be able to change that mechanism. But there are practices to be able to shut down that response once it gets to the first stage of activation. So when we're in the first couple stages. So there's two different kinds of stress. We have eustress, which is good stress. So this is the stress like I have right now that I'm excited to do this. Before an athletic event, I would get stressed, but that's good stress because what it does is it creates this kind of tunnel vision and this focus to be able to do the task at hand. The bad stress is when our body goes into fight or flight for no reason other than perceived reason. So this means that our body is going into reaction mode. It shuts off certain systems, and we'll get into that in a little bit, and then it creates that response. The definition of stress is anything that is perceived as a threat. So perceived is the key word here. This determines the intensity and the duration of what's going to happen. So intensity of what is released, hormonal, we'll just keep it hormonal, and then the amount of time that it exists. So first, our body releases adrenaline. After a bit, it releases cortisol, and I'll go into the exact details of kind of the layout of what happens there. Um, we have the power to be able to manifest danger in our minds. And this is the difference between stress and anxiety. So, anxiety is where our body sends an internal alarm that there is a concern that is caused by no external event. So this is where our mind perceives and creates the event in our head, causing anxiety. It's the anticipation of a threat. Stress is an external threat and our body's reaction to the external events. Once it's gone, the stress is gone. So sometimes when we cross those two over, we say, oh, I'm so stressed. When in reality, we're probably in more of an anxious mode because our body is perceiving that stress. The events that are going on in our world today are definitely causing an incredible amount of perceived stress. Every time we walk out the door, every time we do something, we have this underlying perceived stress. And this is where these practices, these yoga and Ayurvedic practices, are going to be key in how we step forward, how we continue our lives. Because in reality, how many of these things are really going to go away? They're only going to be a different version of them. And if we don't learn how to deal with what we have now, we're not going to be able to deal with the bigger things that happen later. Because if you think these are the biggest things, it's just going to keep on building. So how are we going to take care of ourselves? So the history of human evolution is, in the past, our body reacted to stress to be able to save our lives. Now, it's based on experience. So like, let's say we had something happen to us as a child. So my cousin was attacked by a rooster as a child. Now, as an adult, she is terrified of roosters because of that experience. It's a pretty primitive type event, but it's something when she was a child that had happened. And we have lots of these events that have happened in our lives. Something that happened if we were bullied when we were a kid. We carry that into our life right now as a perceived stress. So if our significant other or a friend or coworker or somebody in our life creates that sort of event that brings up that stress response, it is based on something that's happened in the past. And this is all stress. So good stress, bad stress, whatever. Perceived stress, real stress is based on a past event. Okay. All right, the body's stress response. So our stress begins in our brain, all up in here, all up in our head, right? It is started with the limbic system. So the amygdala is where the center of the brain that is the emotional center and detects potential threats. Okay. And if needed, it activates the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is what triggers the fight or flight response. So that's the sequence of events. It goes to the amygdala, and then it either activates or does not activate based on the perceived threat. So if it's a true threat, even if it's a perceived threat, it has to decipher the difference, and then it activates the hypothalamus. When the hypothalamus is activated, it releases epinephrine, which is also known as adrenaline. Okay, this is when the psychological stuff starts to change. Okay, so at first our body's just running normal, doing its normal thing, digesting food, our immune system is working, our cognitive function is clear, we can kind of multitask, meaning there's good and bad multitasking. So bad multitasking is when you're trying to do too many activities at the same time, really not a good thing. But if you're trying to drive and pay attention to other things, that would be a form of multitasking. That's important. Okay, that's where this is going to get more important as we start to get in what stress actually does to us. So we go into the psychological changes. Our heart rate increases, our body starts to create sweat, we start to perspire, we increase blood flow to the limbs. So away from the center of our body, out to our limbs. And then our lungs expand to create more room for breath in case we have to flee or fight to be able to have that strength. So we increase strength, we increase endurance, all of that stuff increases, and all of it's external. Our mind also gets tunnel vision. So we become more acutely aware of things, but we don't have a larger perspective. It creates more of a focused expression. So this means our digestive system shuts down for the most part, significantly slows, we'll say that, significantly slows. Our immune system is pretty much shut down. Our reproductive system is shut down. Why? Because we don't need to digest food if we're in a life-threatening situation. We don't need immunity because if we're dead, it doesn't matter anyway. We don't need to reproduce because, again, if we're dead, it doesn't matter anyway. So when we go into fight or flight, when we release adrenaline, our body goes into those response. So the first response is heart rate increases, sweating, blood flow to the limbs, and lung expansion. This then starts to activate and shut down the other systems. So when it goes external, shuts down the systems of the center of our body. Okay, we only need to survive, and then we can shut down the system and go on. So if the threat leaves, then our body shuts things down, runs through its the adrenaline runs through the system because it's fairly short hormone, and then we go on with life. If it continues, we start to release cortisol. So the second system that is released is the cortisol. So this is the stress system. This prepares us for action. This prepares us to actually flee or to fight. Okay, the reason this is important is because if it's perceived stress, you can see how this shuts things down that don't need to be shut down at all. If it's actual stress, like being attacked, then we have to have that stress hormone of cortisol. So cortisol goes two ways. Cortisol is good for us. So in Ayurveda, we talk a lot about the circadian rhythm. So our body's natural clock and how our body needs to function on that natural clock. It helps us get up in the morning. It helps us to digest food. We're talking little tiny bits of cortisol that creates energy. When it's activated for fight or flight, it's a pretty high dosage of it. Okay. The bad part about cortisol is when it's too much or too long, it affects the immune system. It affects memory. It affects fear and mental illness. So anxiety, depression, and then the extremes of bipolar and stuff like that, because it definitely activates that. And then diseases, all the way, cancer, heart disease, all of those. And I'll list those in a little bit. All right. If it prolongs too long, it desensitizes the immune system. And this is really important, and it'll be more important later when we talk more about the immune system. But when it desensitizes our immune system, it means our immune response will either be not as good, or over respond, which causes more inflammation in our body. Okay, once the stress response affects our thinking and cognitive, so it affects our mind, it blocks distractions. So when I was talking about our mind getting more focused on one thing, which is a good thing when you're talking about eustress, it's a bad thing when we're talking about perceived stress or a real stressful thing to be able to either fight or flight. So having that one mind focus is really important. Versus if it's perceived stress and we start getting linear focus, then we're not able to make really good decisions. So the consequences are we can make a really poor decision, like yell at our significant other, yell at one of our coworkers. Because we're under stress, our body gets a linear thought and does not activate our prefrontal cortex. Our prefrontal cortex is the part of our brain that basically is the buffer system. Okay, it's a buffer system for our reactivity. And if that is deactivated because of fight or flight, because of adrenaline and cortisol, then we tend to make raw emotion decisions. So we make decisions based on survival. Isn't that cool? Sorry, I get a little excited about that. It's based on raw decisions to survive. So we get upset at, like, let's say our significant other, because we are so focused, our body is so focused on surviving. It has this focus that he is doing something that is attacking and causing me to be able to react because I only have this focus versus having this perspective. That's why sometimes we can step back after a fight and say, oh yeah, I can definitely see how I contributed to that event. And if you can't, you probably should, because we all contribute to it in some way, shape, or form, no matter how long you've been with your significant other, your friends, your family, whatever it is. If you can pull back and see from their perspective, that's what we lose in fight or flight when we get that narrowed vision. Okay, our immune system. So what happens in our immune system when the fight or flight goes into activation is our body goes into pro-inflammatory chemicals. So these are called cytokines. Cytokines help our immune system to be able to decipher the difference between if the immune system has to fight a disease or illness, or if our immune system has to bring in more stuff to create positive inflammation to be able to heal. Okay. The backside to that is it can go into what's called a cytokine storm. So a cytokine storm would be the inflammatory type diseases and illnesses like arthritis, that kind of thing. So what we see is when our body is fighting an injury or an illness, it's a positive thing. When our body is not, meaning when it goes into a cytokine storm, it creates completely the opposite. Okay, so our body gets ready for battle, in other words. Cool? All right. So some of the illnesses that are a part of the autoimmune response. So when our autoimmune response, when our body goes into fight or flight and creates this autoimmune response that's overproductive, what happens in our body, it creates disease and illness. Dis-ease would be the first step. So meaning our body is just thrown off or out of balance. Disease is the next step. Illness is the final step. So we might have poor digestion. So it'll affect our digestive, our gut bacteria, our balance of flora in our digestive system. Heart disease, because cortisol can cause imbalance in our cholesterol. Okay, I'll just say imbalance, not to get too specific in all of that. Infectious diseases. So diseases that spread very easily. It weakens our immune system, as I've talked about, and it creates increase in infectious diseases. Pain disorders, because our stress response changes the way the body deals with internal stress, the actual illnesses and diseases and imbalances that are going on, it increases pain. Alzheimer's and dementia. And usually this is because it affects our sleep. Cortisol, like I said before, in the circadian rhythm, helps us to wake up in the morning. So that means if we have cortisol running through our system through the entire day, and we go to bed at night and we still have high stress levels, then it's going to be harder to sleep, which in turn causes the plaque in our brain to build up. And I'll talk about this in the next lecture. Breast and prostate cancer specifically, because what does it do? It shuts off our sex hormones, or affects or takes away our sex hormones. And we'll talk about that in the hormone lecture. All right. Any questions about that? Okay, so some of the practices that we're going to get started with in week 1 are meditation, drinking lemon water, taking time to notice your diet, your nutrition, exercise, movement, the choices that you make, your routine, stress level, perception of life, and past trauma. So these are some of the basic steps to just be able to create more perception. So when things happen to you, when you feel your heart start to race, or you start to feel the anxiety, or you feel that your body is starting to react to something, that's the time to be able to shut it down, especially when it's perceived stress. If you get in a car accident, let it run its course, because that's the idea. It's supposed to do that job. But if it's perceived stress of something that you're anxious about, or something that you are worried about or creating worry about, then what you can do is breathing techniques. They're probably the most powerful next to meditation. Meditation is hands down the most researched and most beneficial thing you can possibly do for stress, because what it does is it slows everything down. And because our society is such a go, 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 stimulate, 100 miles an hour, constantly stimulated by something external, we don't take time to take care of this vessel. So meditation is by far the number one thing. Breathing is instant though, and it takes very little of it to do a lot of good. So when you feel yourself perceive some sort of stress, you feel maybe your heart rate start to rise, maybe you even start to sweat a little bit, maybe your mind starts to race, or you might have other things that you notice. Maybe you start breathing different, or you feel heart palpitations. It depends on the person. But this is the time to do practices like pratyoloma or brasrika. So brasrika is the one I teach in the beginning of my yoga class, and pratyoloma I do too, where we take the deep breaths. And what it does is it instantly activates your sympathetic or your parasympathetic nervous system. So your sympathetic nervous system is your fight or flight response. Your parasympathetic nervous system is the one that shuts it down. So the rest and digest part. And it's really important to activate that as soon as you feel the stress. Changing your mind isn't fast enough. Breathing is much more effective, and it brings the breath and blood back into here. So we want to slow things down, and then you can do the cognitive stuff. But what happens is your mind goes like this first. So we want to take that and work in our body, because our body is the easiest thing to manipulate right away. So doing brasrika for only about a minute. So you can just look at your watch and you go, forced inhale, forced exhale, and try to catch your breath right into your rib cage, not high in your chest, into your rib cage. And what this does is it activates your parasympathetic nervous system. So adrenaline is released first, then cortisol. If we can keep cortisol from being released, we save our body a lot of backhauling. Okay, our cortisol takes away from our hormones, which is huge when we're talking about reproduction, and not necessarily producing other people, but just keeping our mind balanced. So it doesn't matter what stage of life you're in, this will affect your levels of hormones. And usually it affects progesterone, which keeps estrogen in balance, which is key. And we'll talk about that in the hormone lecture. So those are practices that you can do. Tongue scraping. So we're going back to basic practices. I'll talk more about this in routines next week. Increase water intake, so room temperature or warmer. And then shutting down about an hour before bed. So if your lights out are at 10:30, shutting down. So getting off of social media, limiting the amount of social media. So often we look at social media as like, I want to stay somewhat informed. And I get that. Okay, that's what I do. I try to keep myself informed on certain things. But how easy is it to get distracted and then get into some sort of like spin wheel of maybe not all that accurate of information? So realize that over half the news that's out there is not the truth. So it's designed to activate us. And we really want to pull back and say, does this feel like the truth? Does it really feel like the truth? And that goes from whatever end you're on, whatever part of the world you're in. You really need to figure out, is that really, does my soul feel that that's the truth? Not my mind. Mind's a whole different process. But do I feel that on the inside? Okay. So that was the basic information. There's a lot more, but I wanted to give you an overview of what the stress response is.